From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The Liberal Party actually finds itself at present in an even worse position than when it had its devastating election loss last year. Since then, its poll numbers have fallen dramatically, and many of its voters on its right flank have turned to One Nation. The Liberals are on their second leader, and their long-term future is problematic. Some of their present troubles lie in the coalition's often difficult years in government between 2013 and 2022. In his just-released book titled The Twilight of Exceptionalism, journalist Paul Kelly shines a critical light on these often wasted years of the prime ministerships of Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. Kelly is editor-at-large at the Australian newspaper and has authored major histories of Australian politics from the 1970s on. He joins us today. Paul Kelly, let's start with the big picture. Your book explores the whole coalition government period. What's your take on the major failures of that period?
I think the major failures, Michelle, were that the coalition government misread the times and misread the country. When Tony Abbott first won in 2013, there was a tendency to think this would be business as usual, another successful coalition government, just like John Howard. But in actual fact, the country had changed, and the country wasn't prepared for some of the Liberal policies, in particular the first Abbott hockey budget. So the first point to make is they misread the times, they misread the extent to which Australia had changed. The other really important point to make, of course, is that the government was bedevilled the whole period of time with leadership instability, leadership rivalry, divisions over fundamental policy, and at the end of the day, when they lost the final election in 2022, the electorate had decided they didn't trust the Liberal Party anymore. They didn't have confidence in the Liberal Party. It had chopped and changed its policies too much, and there was a confusion about what the party actually represented.
I want to go to the particular prime ministers. Firstly, Tony Abbott. You say that he suffered from three fatal assumptions: that he wouldn't be challenged in his first term, that his victory was a vindication of his political worldview, and that Parliament should and would be willing to legislate his mandate. How do you think these assumptions shaped his prime ministership and led to his fall?
Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, when they came in as Prime Minister and Treasurer, were too overconfident. And in particular, of course, you'll recollect Joe Hockey talking about the end of the age of entitlement. So they came in with really ambitious plans to transform the country. That first budget was to be a budget of transformation, and they misread the situation. Now, in terms of the three assumptions I've made about Tony Abbott, I think they were fundamental, and each of them I think was flawed. Tony Abbott, while he was really sensitive about Malcolm Turnbull, was completely convinced, and he said this to me on the record, that he'd be safe from any challenge for the first term. Well, that was a really serious misjudgment. He then felt that the election had been a vindication of his policies and a vindication of his mandate. But the fact of the matter is that he tried to do a lot of things that he didn't have a mandate for, particularly in that first budget. And then, of course, I think finally, they misread the nature of the Parliament. They felt that they'd be able to get most of their measures through the Parliament, in particular through the Senate, but that proved much more difficult. And so obstruction from the Senate became a real problem for them in terms of their agenda. So I think in terms of the parliamentary party, in terms of the Parliament, and in terms of the electorate, Tony Abbott made judgments which misled him. And you can't, as Prime Minister, make those sort of judgments which prove to be too inaccurate.
With Malcolm Turnbull, we always knew that he'd move heaven and earth to seize the Prime Ministership, and he did that and was seen as a charismatic figure. And yet it all seemed to fizzle. He was like the dog that chased the car, and having got the car, caught the car. He didn't know what to do then. What was his flaw?
The point to make about Malcolm Turnbull is the expectations about Turnbull, about his ability and about his prime ministership when he first got the job, were ludicrous. There was no way Turnbull could have possibly lived up to some of the expectations that some of his supporters, particularly his supporters in the media, had of him. Turnbull was the leader of the Liberal Party and a coalition prime minister, and he had to make a lot of concessions. The idea that he was going to come in and suddenly transform climate change policy, or put the same-sex marriage bill to the parliament, or even do something about the republic, all this was simply a fantasy. But Turnbull eventually became criticised by a lot of people because they felt that he wasn't living up to his core beliefs. Well, of course he had those core beliefs, but he had the limitations of being a coalition prime minister. The other point I make about Malcolm Turnbull is I've called him an optimistic technocrat. He was a rationalist. He always said, if you want to know what policy I'm going to adopt, ask yourself, what is the rational policy? Because that's where I'll be. Okay, he was a rationalist operating in an ideological age. He was not an instinctive politician. He was all at sea when it came to understanding the ideology of the Liberal Party and how it worked. And try to sell yourself as a prime minister who was an optimistic and rationalist technocrat was never going to work with the Australian public.
You detail the attacks on Scott Morrison's character and how devastating they were for his prime ministership. Looking back on that period, a very turbulent period, do you think he brought these attacks on himself, or do you think they were unfair, that they went over the top in many instances?
That's a really good question, Michelle, and I think the answer is it's both. So there were certainly character defects in Scott Morrison. There's no question about that. There were character and personality defects. He lacked empathy, and he governed at a time when we saw the feminisation of politics, where prime ministers were required to display sensitivity and empathy, and Morrison had a lot of trouble doing that. He was an old-fashioned bloke from the age when men ran politics and they operated in a fairly aggressive way, and they weren't too strong when it came to empathy. At the same time, of course, he cut corners, he was loose with the truth, and he tended to blame other people for his own mistakes. So there were personality and character defects, no question about that at all. Having said that, he was unfairly attacked, particularly over the Brittany Higgins situation, the rape of Brittany Higgins, which was subsequently confirmed by the courts. But essentially what happened there was Higgins teamed up with the Labor Party to wage a campaign against Scott Morrison, arguing that the government, that Scott Morrison and Linda Reynolds had covered up the accusations, had covered up the rape, they'd put pressure on her, and the Labor Party used that very successfully in a very protracted campaign against Scott Morrison, which lasted about 12 months, really damaged his character. That campaign was false. That campaign was based on false claims, and Justice Michael Lee in the federal court exposed that brilliantly. The other point I'd make, though, is I think that Morrison would have lost the election anyway. I'm not saying he lost the election in 2022 because of the Brittany Higgins affair. I think he would have lost anyway.
Let's turn now to the present and the future. You and I have covered federal politics for almost exactly the same time, and we've seen many crises in political parties, in the major parties. But have we seen anything like the crises that the Liberals now face?
Well, I don't know about you, Michelle, but I've certainly never seen a crisis like this, a Liberal Party bedevilled by this combination of really dangerous forces that now inflicts it. I do think it's an existential crisis for the Liberals. It is just extraordinary that we've had these polls now for quite a while showing that Pauline Hanson leads the major parties on the centre-right, and some of the polls showing that she was even ahead of the Albanese government. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a cultural and political crisis on the centre-right of Australian politics. And I think it's doubtful whether the Liberal Party that we've seen for so long, the party of Menzies, Malcolm Fraser and John Howard, I don't think we're going to see the Liberal Party going back to that former party and regaining its former authority. Now, I'm not saying the Liberal Party can't recover. I wouldn't say that. But I'm saying the task of recovery for the Liberals is going to be truly daunting. And what Angus Taylor's got to do above all else, the absolute urgent test coming up is he's got to get the Liberal Party primary vote ahead of One Nation. If he can't do that, if he goes into the next election with the One Nation primary vote ahead of the Liberals, then the results will be a catastrophe in the subsequent parliament for the Liberal Party.
Well, he's pursuing economic policy, which is traditionally the Liberals' strong ground, and he gave that speech the other day which set out traditional conservative economic values: smaller government, lower taxes, more emphasis on empowering individuals. But doesn't he have this fundamental problem that people these days don't want smaller government? They want, in fact, bigger government. They want government to do more, give them more. And so how does he cope with that mismatch?
I think that is a problem. I think the disposition of the public is to favour a bigger government, favour government doing more. But the advantage that he's got, I think, is that Albanese economic policies are failing, and they're failing big time. And I think that if we look at what's going to happen over the next 12 months, it's going to be a pretty frightening scenario for the government, because essentially we are locked into now a low growth situation, stagnant living standards, flatline productivity, falling real wages, inhibited investment. So this is overall a really daunting and challenging situation for the government. I think they're going to be in a lot of trouble, and I think one of the fundamental arguments that will emerge is this government so ideological and so stubborn that it's pursuing the interests of the Liberal Party and not pursuing the interests of Australia. So Taylor will have a lot to work with. The main thing he's got to do, I think we are now living in a time of bold policies. Incrementalism won't cut it. I think Taylor understands this, and he's not going to go back to the slash and burn and entitlement campaigns of Abbott and Hockey. That's not going to happen. While he's developing what could be seen as a traditional Liberal Party approach, there'll be significant differences. I think the tax indexation thing, the tax cuts are going to be really, really important here. I think they're going to be looking at doing two things simultaneously: working on productivity to increase living standards and putting money back into people's pockets pretty quickly. So I think that's going to be the essential approach. It'll be hard for him, there's no doubt about that. The Liberal Party's in a weak condition. Taylor is not a natural cut-through politician, so he's going to have to, first of all, devise his agenda. I think there's a lot more coming in terms of this bold agenda from Taylor, but then, of course, selling it is going to be a pretty difficult task.
But he is wedged, isn't he, on various fronts? For example, it does seem that the government has a stranglehold on the female vote at the moment, and a lot of its policies and decisions have been directed to reinforcing that. And also, the Liberals surely can't actually get to government unless they can win back those traditional urban seats that they used to hold, and yet the Teals are entrenched there. So those are real problems for them.
I agree totally. I mean, I think the Liberal Party faces a political obstacle and a cultural obstacle. I think the cultural thing is really important. I think wide sections of the Australian community have really turned their backs on the Liberal Party, and you're right to identify particular constituencies. I would identify three in particular. I think tertiary educated voters tend to be of the left and tend to be disillusioned with the Liberal Party and the coalition. Then you've got female voters, in particular I think professional women, again, pretty hostile towards the Liberal Party, lost a lot of trust and confidence in the Liberal Party. And then you've got younger voters, people younger than their mid-30s. Again, these people tend to be looking to the left, looking to Labor or even the Greens. So the structural problem is a really serious problem. You're right that Taylor's fighting on two fronts. He's fighting the Teals on the one hand, and it's very hard to see how he's going to unseat many of these Teals at the next election. On the other hand, of course, he's fighting One Nation, and that is a problem from the right. So the magnitude of this challenge in terms of the constituents and in terms of fighting on two fronts is really enormous.
You've been very, very critical of Pauline Hanson, and indeed you've said that recent events have just exposed Hanson as unsuitable for any role in executive government. And yet her supporters just don't seem to notice or worry about anything she does. For example, her recent trips, that provocative podcast with Tommy Robinson, cavorting about in Sicily with Gina Reinhardt. Do you think at any point at least these soft One Nation voters are going to say, well, this is not an appropriate leader?
Look, I could be wrong, but I think the One Nation vote will come off from where it is. I don't know how far it'll come off, but the point I'd make is at the end of the day, I think that the Australian public are not going to cast a vote without cognizance of the governing merits of the political parties. I think at some point, the factor of governing merit must come into the way people cast their vote. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I think this is a view widely held, Hanson is not a viable contender in terms of any role in governing Australia. Her policies are a mishmash to the extent one can sort out what they actually mean. They are really dangerous for the country. They would damage our living standards, damage the ordinary household, and turn Australia into a pariah nation, frankly. So I think Hanson, in terms of the merit, is simply unacceptable. I agree that she's got a lot of support at the moment, and this indicates, I think, a bit of a cultural crisis in the country. The country is very disillusioned with the major parties. It's disillusioned with the political system itself. And part of this is because people are doing it hard these days. And that's probably going to continue. And I think this sense of unhappiness and grievance is driving the Hanson vote. I think the vote will remain reasonably high, and that's going to be a terrible problem for the Liberals, but it will come off. And I think, as I said before, I don't think Hanson has got any role to play in terms of the executive government in this country. The worst mistake people on the centre-right can make, the worst mistake Liberals can make, is to entertain the idea of some sort of coalition with One Nation. That won't work for the Liberals. And of course, as far as Anthony Albanese is concerned, he knows that the rise of Pauline Hanson is just music to the ears for the Labor Party, because all she does is she discredits the centre-right, and that's probably going to guarantee that Albanese will remain in government.
Do you think that the Liberals would be better able to combat Hanson if Andrew Hastie, who's been very critical of her, were leader? Obviously, I know that Taylor has been critical recently, but he's been a bit late to the party.
I think the Liberals have got to stick with Angus Taylor. A lot of people won't agree with that. I think continuing to change the leadership of the Liberal Party is a mistake. I like Andrew Hastie very much, and I respect him very much, but it's a mistake for the Liberals to use as the sole criteria for the leadership who makes the toughest comments about Pauline Hanson. I mean, really, that's not the criteria for Liberal leadership today. The Liberal Party is facing an enormous crisis, and what is required is creative policy and political skills. And if the party can't unite behind Angus Taylor, then I don't really see how it's going to unite behind anyone else. So I think they've got to live with the situation they're now in and make the most of that.
Let's finish off with Anthony Albanese. You've been writing in your columns that Albanese has a long-term agenda that is much more radical, really, than many people recognise. He moves with caution, but his destination is quite radical. Can you just expand on that view?
I think Anthony Albanese is a sort of misunderstood and misinterpreted Prime Minister in many ways. There's no doubt that Albanese, particularly in the first term, was careful and cautious. He didn't want to upset the horses. He said to me when I interviewed him for my book that the Australian people won't vote for radical agendas at elections. And so while in the old days he was a bit of a warrior and a bit of a left-winger, that's what he now thinks. He puts a high premium on stability and predictability, and I think in that sense he's correct. That's what the Australian people want. The interesting thing when you look at the Labor Party and how he governs is that this is a government which is remarkably unified and remarkably disciplined, and to a large extent speaks with one voice. So all this reinforces the sense of Albanese as a cautious and a pragmatic Prime Minister who's careful about what he does on the policy front. But there's another perspective as well. And when you look at the other perspective, I think you can see, and what I've argued is that Albanese is a transforming Prime Minister, not in any particular week or month or year, but essentially he's playing a long game. And he's playing a game in which he hopes to get, or at least assure for the Labor Party, a 3-term Labor government. Well, we're not even at the halfway mark of that. And when we look at what's happening, we can see that he is transforming the country. He runs a big government, a big spending agenda. He is committed to ambitious targets when it comes to climate change and renewable energy. He's transformed the industrial relations system in favour of the union movement. He's committed to a number of social initiatives, in particular with the care economy. So you can see this sense of transformation. It's underway. And what I've argued is, if this continues at the current rate, at the end of 3 terms, this Labor government will have transformed the country and it will have transformed the country in a way that the centre-right will have a lot of trouble reversing.
Paul Kelly, thank you very much for sharing your insights into history and also the present and the future. And congratulations on this latest book. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.